This is one of the strangest Appalachian Mountains horror stories to come out of Lost Cove, North Carolina. And it starts with 5 words his grandpa said before he died: "Stay out of that hollow." Denny Ledford had heard that sentence his whole life and never once heard the reason behind it. Wendell Ledford didn't explain rules. He just made them permanent. What Denny didn't know was that 6 people had already died on that same 100 acres. Every one of them within 500 yards of a bowl-shaped hollow that doesn't appear on any survey map, every death blamed on the same impossible cause. And on his first night back, a woman's voice was going to start singing behind the barn. One his family had heard before, decades after the person singing it was supposed to be gone. "44 years old, 11 of those years spent behind a hardware counter in Marshall, North Carolina, Denny had let the Lost Cove property sit in his name only on paper for 3 years, hoping the county would forget to finish the deed transfer. In late April, they didn't forget. He clipped his grandpa's old folding rule to his belt out of habit before he left, the wooden kind with brass hinges, mismarked at the 14-inch fold from a drop back in '99. He hadn't measured a board with it in years. He just liked having it on him. He drove up alone on a Tuesday to a house nobody had slept in since the funeral. The county register of deeds had left him 3 messages in 2 weeks. Probate law only gave him so long before the county forced a tax reassessment on an unclaimed structure, and the surveyor was already booked to walk the property line Thursday morning. 3 days out. Wendell had kept a 50-foot buffer around the hollow his whole life, hand-painted on the trees, never filed with the county. Once those new pins went in the ground Thursday, that buffer stopped existing on paper. The drive-in took 40 minutes past the last gas station, then 2 more miles of rutted fire road that ate mufflers for a living. It was loud with all the wrong things: gravel kicking up under the wheel wells, a loose exhaust bracket ticking against the frame, the radio losing signal mile by mile until it was just static he forgot to turn off. Past the last cattle gate, the sound just dropped out of the truck cab like someone had reached in and switched it off. The house key was exactly where his grandpa always left it, wedged behind a loose porch board, which didn't sit right with him at all, because that board had been screwed down flush the last time he'd stood on this porch, 3 years and 1 funeral ago. Somebody had pried it loose since then and left no other sign of being there. From the porch, if you looked past the barn, you could see the hollow itself. A shallow, unnaturally round bowl of land, tree line curving around it smooth and even, like something had traced a compass circle into the mountain, and the forest just grew up to match it. Denny had played near that tree line as a kid and never once gone past it, because his grandpa's rule didn't need repeating twice. His grandpa used to say a fence you can see is a suggestion. A fence nobody drew is the one that actually matters. He'd said it at every property dispute the family ever had, standing at that same tree line, and Denny had never once asked him what he meant by it. Now there was nobody left to ask. He got the wood stove going, unrolled a sleeping bag on a bare mattress that still smelled like cedar and mothballs, and told himself one night out here wasn't going to kill him. He almost believed it. That was around 11. At 2 in the morning, a woman started singing behind the barn. The singing didn't stop when Denny sat up in the sleeping bag. It kept going, working through the same handful of lines over and over, a woman's voice picking through a song called Pretty Sorrow, like she was learning it fresh instead of remembering it. Denny knew that song. His grandmother used to hum it while she canned tomatoes, off a reel-to-reel tape his grandpa burned in a barrel behind the smokehouse back in 1973, 4 years before Denny was born. Nobody in the family ever said why he burned it. It was just one of those facts that got mentioned and dropped, like a scar nobody explains. He told himself it was a memory doing what memories do at 2 in the morning in an unfamiliar house. But the sound was coming through the window screen, thin and cold against the hair on his arm, moving the air the exact way a real sound moves air. And memories don't do that. The porch light outside had a hum to it, a dying ballast working toward burning out. The same pitch the light over the hardware counter back in Marshall made about 6 months before it needed replacing. He'd heard that sound 100 times at work. It was almost comforting, hearing something so ordinary out here, which made the singing behind it feel so much worse. He got up, dug through a cedar trunk at the foot of the bed for a working flashlight, and got a face full of camphor for his trouble. Under the mothball smell was something else. Wet limestone, the specific mineral smell of a cave mouth, damp rock that's never seen sun, and no earthly reason a bedroom trunk should smell like the inside of a mountain. His hand found a photograph tucked under a stack of folded quilts. His grandmother, Ola Ledford, young, standing at the edge of the tree line around the hollow, squinting into the sun. Someone had written a date on the back in pencil, faded but legible. Denny did the math twice because he didn't believe it the first time. The date was 2 months after the date on her death certificate. Cause of death, exposure. That answered what she looked like young, something he'd never actually seen a photo of before. But it opened up something worse right behind it, because somebody had to load a camera, walk her to that tree line, frame the shot, get the film developed, and hand her back a finished print 2 months after the county had already put her in the ground. Denny sat on the edge of the bed a long time holding that photograph, flashlight beam shaking just slightly across her face. He needed air. He walked out onto the porch in his socks and ran his thumb along the barn doorframe out of nothing but habit, the way you'd trace a groove in a table without meaning to. His thumb caught on something. A row of small notches cut into the wood, evenly spaced, old enough that most had gone gray and smooth at the edges. He figured it for some old farmer's habit, a mark for every year worked, something Wendell probably did without mentioning it, same as everything else. He counted 11 in the dark before he lost patience and went back inside, deciding it didn't matter enough to keep standing barefoot at 2 in the morning. The singing was still going when he shut the door. Same lines, same order. Like whoever was down there hadn't learned the rest of the song yet, or didn't need to. The porch light kept humming behind him, steady, dying, exactly the way it should. Past it, right where the light gave out and the tree line started, something was holding a pitch of its own. Level, unwavering. The kind of steady, no-failing bulb has ever managed to hold. Denny didn't go back out to check. He told himself that was the smart move. He lay back down instead, phone flashlight still on, and listened to a song he hadn't heard since he was a kid, coming from a hollow his grandfather told him never to go near, sung by a voice with no earthly reason to still be out there. Denny made it into Burnsville a little after 8 the next morning, mostly to get 4 bars of signal back and mostly to stop thinking about the photograph long enough to eat something that wasn't out of a cooler. He sat in a diner booth with his phone plugged into a wall outlet behind him and started pulling up Yancey County death records on the property, going back as far as the digitized files would let him. 6 deaths, across 110 years. Every one of them tied to that 100 acres. Every single one of them listed the same cause, exposure, and every one happened within 500 yards of the hollow. County policy on unincorporated land back then let families bury where the person was found, so as far as Denny could tell, none of those 6 had ever actually been moved. That answered why the land carried a reputation nobody in the family ever talked about out loud. But sitting there with his coffee going cold, Denny noticed something that made his stomach drop a little further. Exposure deaths cluster in winter. That's just how it works. 4 of the 6 on that list were dated in months warm enough that a grown adult had no business dying of cold within a 5-minute walk of a heated house. He should have packed up right then. He knew it even as he sat there. Instead, he called his cousin Retta, a musicologist finishing her doctorate at UT Knoxville, and told her what he'd heard the night before. She went quiet for a second, then asked if he could get her a clean recording. Denny told himself one more night wouldn't change anything. He'd already survived one. He downloaded a recording app onto his phone before he even left the booth. Driving back out toward the cattle gate, he found himself turning his grandpa's old line over in his head. A fence you can see is a suggestion. A fence nobody drew is the one that actually matters. For the first time since he'd arrived, Denny wondered if his grandfather hadn't meant the property line at all. Maybe he'd meant that tree line around the hollow the whole time, and the surveyor's pins had never been the thing worth protecting. That night, he sat out on the porch steps with his phone recording and propped against his knee, waiting. The cold came up through his boot soles first, before anything else did. It wasn't the ordinary chill of an April night in the mountains. It was localized, pulling straight off the direction of the hollow, the same way cold air pools out from a basement door somebody's left open a crack. Sometime after midnight, the barn door groaned and swung open about an inch. Wendell's last letters had mentioned that door being swollen shut all spring, stuck solid enough he'd needed a shoulder to close it the last time he tried. There was no wind that night to account for it moving. Denny sat perfectly still on the steps and watched the gap in the door frame like it might tell him something if he waited long enough. It didn't sing that night, not right away. For a long while there was nothing but the cold pooling around his ankles and that door hanging open an inch in the dark, and Denny found himself doing the math on Thursday morning instead. 2 days left before the surveyor walked the line and those buffer trees stopped meaning anything on paper. Then, just past 1, the voice started again, closer to the barn than it had been the night before, working through the same handful of lines like nothing at all had changed. Denny didn't move. He kept the phone angled toward the sound, thumb steady on the record button, and told himself Retta's software would explain all of this by tomorrow afternoon. He believed that right up until the recording caught something underneath the singing that he hadn't noticed at all with his own ears. Something buried low in the frequency that he wouldn't be able to make sense of until his phone rang the next afternoon and Retta's voice came through, sounding like she'd already made up her mind about something. Retta called back a little after 4 the next afternoon, and the first thing Denny noticed was that she wasn't asking questions anymore. She was telling him things. The vocal decay pattern, she said, the way the frequencies broke down at the edges of certain syllables, only showed up in recordings made within the last 5 years. Whatever was singing in that hollow wasn't some echo bleeding off his grandpa's old reel-to-reel tape. It wasn't old at all. It was happening right now, in real time, every single night. That answered the question sitting on Denny's chest since 2 in the morning 2 nights ago. It also handed him a worse one right behind it, because Retta mentioned, almost like an afterthought, that she was already in her car. She'd left Knoxville an hour ago. She wanted to hear it herself tonight, driving the fire road alone in the dark with no idea what was waiting at the end of it. Denny's phone showed 1 bar, enough to call, not enough to hold a sentence longer than a few seconds before it dropped. He needed to reach her before she got past the cattle gate. He grabbed the flashlight and headed for the barn without really deciding to, some part of him needing to touch something solid first. His hand found the doorframe in the dark and this time he ran the beam down it slow, counting every notch top to bottom instead of losing patience halfway through like the first night. 11 notches, same as before. But this time he counted the spacing too, and the spacing wasn't even. They clustered, tight groups broken by long gaps, almost 2 notches for every one of the 6 deaths on that county record. And down at the bottom, the last notch in the row was pale, fresh. The wood inside the cut hadn't grayed yet the way 100 years of weather had grayed every mark above it. Wendell hadn't been counting years on that doorframe. He'd been counting something else, and he'd still been counting it recently enough that the cut hadn't had time to age. Denny had to decide, standing right there with the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand, whether to run for the fire road and try to flag Retta down before she reached the house, or wait right where he was, closer to whatever this was in case she needed him at the house instead. There wasn't a version of that choice that felt safe. Either way put someone alone near that tree line in the dark, and he only had a few seconds to pick. He ran. The singing was louder now than it had been either of the last 2 nights, close enough that Denny could hear a specific catch in the voice, right on the same word his grandmother always used to catch on when she hummed it over the canning pots. The cold from the hollow wasn't pooling around his ankles anymore. It hit him like a wall through his jacket all at once, head to chest. And underneath it, that limestone and camphor smell from the cedar trunk was out here too. Thick enough now that he could taste it at the back of his throat. Headlights swung across the tree line 2 miles out. Retta's car turning onto the fire road. Denny broke into a dead run down the gravel, lungs burning, boots slipping where the road had gone soft. Then the fog rolled in off the hollow, fast, low to the ground, thick enough that it didn't look like weather at all. There'd been no cloud cover all night, no front moving through. It just poured out from the direction of the bowl-shaped hollow, like something had opened a door. By the time Retta's headlights hit that fog, they weren't cutting through the dark anymore. They were just pushing it back a few feet at a time, barely enough to see the hood of her own car. Denny screamed her name into the 1 bar of signal he had left and got nothing back but static, the same static the truck radio had lost mile by mile the first day he drove in. He kept running anyway, toward the gate, toward the sound of an engine he could hear but couldn't see, the singing behind him rising with every step he put between himself and the barn, like it knew exactly how close she was getting and didn't like losing either of them. The last thing Denny heard clearly before the fog swallowed the gate whole was the voice hitting that same broken note again, the one his grandmother always caught on, except this time it didn't stop there. This time it kept going, into the next line of a verse nobody in his family had ever taught her. Denny reached the gate maybe 10 seconds before Retta's car did, close enough to slap a flat hand against her hood and get her to stand on the brakes before she went any further down that fog-choked road. She rolled the window down white-faced, already asking questions, and Denny just told her to turn the car around. Neither of them went anywhere near the hollow that night. The singing stopped on its own a little after 4 in the morning, the same way it had apparently started and stopped for 110 years, on no schedule either of them could find a pattern in. They sat up together in the truck cab until the sky started going gray, not talking much, just listening to make sure it was really over. Thursday morning, the county surveyor showed up right on time and walked the property line exactly like he was supposed to. Denny had spent both days before that repainting his grandpa's original buffer markers by hand, tree by tree, even though not one of those marks carried any legal weight at all. When the surveyor asked about the 50 feet past the painted trees, Denny told him it was unusable wetland, not worth surveying. The surveyor didn't push back. He drove his pins in exactly where Denny wanted them. The story had started with 5 words Denny never understood, a rule his grandpa handed down without ever once explaining it. It ended with Denny standing at that same tree line, telling Retta the exact same thing Wendell used to tell him. Stay out of that hollow. Except now he said it knowing exactly what it was protecting them from, which turned it from a rule he'd inherited into something closer to peace. Before he locked up the house for good, Denny walked back out to the barn one last time. He took his grandpa's old folding rule off his belt, the one with the mismarked fold at 14 inches, and used the pocket knife from his glove box to press one more notch into the door frame, lined up level with the others. The wood shaving curled off pale and fresh, standing out clean against 100 years of marks that had already gone gray. The yard was quiet when he finally walked back to the truck. The same porch light hummed behind him, same dying ballast, same pitch it had held the whole time he'd been there. It was only standing there in that quiet that Denny noticed what was still missing from it. No birds. There hadn't been any the entire time he'd stayed in that house. He just hadn't been listening for their absence until right now. The notch count still didn't add up to the 6 confirmed deaths on the county record. 11 marks total, not 6. And Denny never did figure out what accounted for the other 5, or whether Wendell had known the answer to that himself before he died. Some rules get handed down without a single reason attached to them, and people follow them anyway. Not because they trust the person who made the rule, but because somewhere along the way, they've learned exactly what happens to the land and to the people on it when nobody does. Denny locked the front door, got in his truck, and drove Retta back out past the cattle gate, leaving the hollow behind him the same way his grandfather had left it for 60 years. Undisturbed, unexplained. And still, as far as anyone could tell, exactly as hungry as it had always been.